When I was gone for approximately 2 months, one of the many things I did was study Russian. There are a lot of things I'm glad that English doesn't have, but plenty of things I wish it did. So here's me creating what is ostensibly a conlang based on English. So let's start with nouns. One of the things Russian does that's very fun is that it still includes declensions for noun cases. That means they have different forms depending on how they're being used. Now, существительное is a bad example because it declines like an adjective, so let's switch over to book. Instead of using their official names, I'm going to translate the Russian case names. So we started with kniga, the naming case. That's used for subjects and objects of to be when it isn't written. Next, we have knigu, the blaming case, used for objects and prepositions of motion. Then knige, the prepositional, is only used with the prepositions. These 5 to be specific, only 3 of which you will ever use. That leaves the ones I actually want. Now, kniga is feminine and other nouns decline differently, plus plurals. We definitely don't need to do that in English or include adjective declensions. Matter of fact, adjectives can remain entirely the same, with one exception, which I'll get to. I'm not interested in the prepositional, I'm also not interested in the accusative. We already have word order, but I am mesmerized by the instrumental or creating case. The instrumental case in Russian is used for what in English is written as with, using, or by. It's also used for prepositions that indicate a position relative to an object without any motion. In English, this idea is difficult to translate, as you can tell by there being 3 different translations. Here's an example. The sentence "Я буду избивать тебя" translates to "I am going to beat you to death" using the informal singular you and with emphasis on the action rather than the outcome. Now, if you append a book in the instrumental, that will be what you're using to complete the action. Whether you're teaching, blessing, filling, eating, the instrumental noun is whatever facilitates the action. Also, use it for the object of to be when you do write it. And what I really like about this is that you don't need a preposition, just throw the noun in there with the right ending. And I wanted to add that to English, but first, I'll go over the other cases which are easier to describe. The giving case, ironically, is used for receiving, generally replacing the word to, and also these prepositions, which have something in common. And finally, the giving birth case, which is used for possessive and also every other preposition. So in Russian, feminine and masculine are both separate from the plural gender, which is just too complicated for me. And since plural is already taking up the ending spot right now, I want to change it. Fortunately, Germanic already has precedent for a plural. So while most plurals end in an S in English, some like man, men have a weird vowel shift. That's called umlaut, and it's cemented in English because these words used to pluralize by adding an I on the end, which in turn changed the vowel before it disappeared. So I'm bringing umlaut back. Go ahead and tell them English speakers that now words are pluralized by umlauting the final vowel. Man stays as changing to men, but now words like book would become book in plural. Do you think I should slowly apply this change I make to the rest of the video? Would that be cool? Probably not. Also, if you haven't noticed, I'm adding back in umlaut vowels and ü. Of course, that's too German, so I'll instead use the English version and ü. So let's figure out the umlauted equivalent of all 17 English vowels in my accent. This is all going to be in my accent because I can't handle anything else. So u becomes ü. Fortunately, oo doesn't really exist in my accent. It's more of an oo sound, so it instead umlauts to ew. The foot vowel umlauts to u, which generally takes the place of u. Now, you could argue that since this is my personal rework of English, I could just decide to make the notation make sense, but I feel vindictive. So, goat becomes goat, strut becomes stret, the combined palmlat thought vowel becomes palmlat that, mouth becomes mouth, choice becomes choice, price becomes prace, trap becomes trep, dress becomes driss, and face becomes feast, and kitten fleece stay the same. Nurse becomes nurse, north becomes nurth, near becomes knee, and square becomes square. Controversially, I'm going to include cure, which becomes cure, and the ash-raised vowel of words like fan and man jumps straight up to fin and min, and I get rid of weak vowels because akanye is stupid, except syllabic consonants which stay syllabic and push umlaut onto the previous vowel. For example, bottle becomes battle, not batil. Savvy? So now that we have the ending space for you, we can get into declensions, starting with the genitive, which exists in English. That's what it is when you use apostrophe s for possessive. It has a pretty intuitive ending, but I will chop off the apostrophe, seeing as plural no longer uses that ending. The dative case, which occupies a weird spot of specifically receiving, is going to be expanded into a full allative case, which represents motion to or towards. We don't have this anymore, but it existed in Old English as a, which would obviously become a schwa and eventually disappear. But if we lengthen it, it becomes e, which I will end up using. So I gave a book to the store becomes I gave the story a book. As is typical in Germanic languages, you have to assign a position in the sentence order for these, which will be directly after the noun and before the object. The same is true for ablative words. Now, ablative, the opposite of allative, was never used in Germanic. They cut it out before they even made it to the Proto-language. But we can still borrow it from the Proto-Indo-European. In PIE, there are multiple different patterns, but the most common are os stems, where the ablative is ead. To the extent that they can be tracked, English declensions tend to follow common sound changes. So I would predict Yaaah for Proto-Germanic to just E by English. Theoretically, that should force the previous vowel to umlaut, but I don't want that, so I'm making a special case. The ablative ending is I, so I gotta store I the book. That leaves the instrumental, and the short vowel oo also drops off unless we lengthen it, in which case it becomes ow in modern English. So that example sentence is, I'm going to be deathy you a book ow. For prepositions, I'm mostly going to do the same as Russian. Motion towards is allative, motion away is ablative, no motion is instrumental, the rest are all genitive. Let's touch on pronouns because they always decline weirdly. The nominatives all stay the same, but I'm adding back in thou and ye. Possessives become genitive forms. Allative are based on the historic dative, which is mostly similar to the modern accusative, so that's me, thee, him, her with an I, hit, us, you, them. They, them is actually loaned from Norse, so it's a bit weirder. Ablative generally ends in a D, but as we saw, D drops off in early Germanic, leaving them identical to the historic accusative. Mech, thech, heen, hi, et, un, yair, theys. And finally, instrumental is pretty similar to dative, but I have moi, thoi, in, ear, it, woi, yoi, thove. I am not a professional. That's all I wanted to fix up for nouns, so let's move on to verbs. Russian, despite how much else it doesn't use, isn't really a pro-drop language. I mean, you can remove the pronouns, but in my understanding, that's only something you do when you're trying to be informal. In most situations, you wouldn't drop pronouns in Russian, but now you will in English. So you might think English nouns don't decline based on person, but they do, because most of the time you don't say I read, you say I am reading, you are reading. And this part definitely changes, so I'm making that the standard for the English present tense. Similarly, I'm making it I will read and I have read instead of I read, or rather just have read. But to drop off all pronouns, I need to create different forms for these three words. Presently, we have am, art, is, which can be extended to include are and areth and sinned. For will, we have will, wilt, wilth, willin, willeth, and wiln. And finally, for have, we have, hast, hath, haven, haveth, and han. The third person plural is always weird in Germanic. Now, you might note that simplifying English down to just a past, present, and future tense greatly reduces the complexity of the language. Russian doesn't have this problem because it secretly has two extras. However, I think English can manage as long as you use constructions like almost, was in the middle of, had just begun, continuing to increase specificity. To that end, I'm simplifying this one to just mid. That means a sentence like, I was in the middle of writing this video when my dad has walked into the room, becomes, have mid written this video when my dad hath walked the roomy. And finally, Russian is of course written in the Cyrillic alphabet, so I'm bringing Faldorch back to write out English. One of the most fun things about Runic alphabets is that all the letters have a name and certain magical properties, so let's meet our new alphabet. Before that, I'd also like to add back in fricative allophony. In another video, which is not about Russian politics, I discussed this phenomena where in Old English, fa and sa were pronounced as va and za in between two vowels. I'm bringing that back, and fa and va are now the same sound. Feuch, meaning wealth, now means value. It makes a fa or va sound. Ur, meaning cattle, now means outlaw. It makes an sound when short and an ow sound when long. Thorn, meaning thorn or hawthorn, stays the same. It makes a th or the sound. Os, meaning heathen god, now means oak. It makes an ah sound when short and an o sound when long. It makes an oo sound when doubled, and it forms the first half of oi and or. Rad, meaning ride, stays the same. It makes an r sound. Ten, meaning torch, now becomes charcoal. It makes a k sound before a back vowel and a ch sound before a front vowel. Yifu, meaning gift, stays the same. It makes a g sound. Win, meaning joy, becomes win. It makes a w sound. Hail, meaning hail, stays the same. It makes a h sound. Nailed, meaning need, stays the same. It makes a n sound. Is, meaning ice, stays the same. It makes an I sound when short and an I sound when long. Year, meaning year, becomes U. It makes a Y sound. U, meaning you, becomes 8. It is silent and represents the historic H sound spelt by GH. Perth, whose meaning is unknown, becomes play. It makes a P sound. Elk, the genitive of elk, becomes axe. It makes a X sound. Ciel, meaning sun, stays the same. It makes a S sound. Tew, meaning the god Tyr, becomes tree. It makes a T sound. Birch, meaning birch, stays the same. It makes a B sound. Ich, meaning horse, becomes elm. It makes an E sound when short and a E sound when long. Man, meaning man, stays the same. It makes a M sound. Laru, meaning lake, stays the same. It makes an ol sound. Ing, meaning fray, becomes anger. It makes a ng sound. Il, meaning homeland, becomes it, the new plural of oat. It makes the new umlauted e sound when short and the e when long. It also forms the first half of e and Dar, meaning day, stays the same. It makes a d sound. Ach, meaning oak, becomes elder. It also makes an ah sound when short, but makes the new I sound when long. Ash, meaning ash, stays the same. It makes a sound when short and an a sound when long. Air, meaning burial ground, becomes underground. It makes a sound when short and a u sound when long, now represented by either ew or a long u. Ur, meaning bow, becomes user, the new plural of user. It makes the new umlauted u sound when short and the u when long. Couch, meaning chalk, becomes kiss. It's used to write the k sound when charcoal would make the wrong sound. J is written as dia, sh is written as sh, and I'm also making j the same as sh when intervocal. That means ocean is now pronounced ocean, garage is pronounced garage, and Elijah and Elisha are pronounced the same. And like I mentioned at the start, there is something I want to change about adjectives or adverbs. Something that caught my attention was that in English we would say this book is impossible to read. Russian appears to be the same, but cases tell us this actually means to read this book is impossible, or it is impossible to read this book. When you add in a subject, they tend to destroy that construction and replace it with I can't read this book. But in English too, I wanted to swap out the dummy subject with a real subject. Therefore, I am impossible to read this book. I also want to do this for all adverbs, so I run quickly becomes am quick to run, I did well on the quiz becomes was good to do on the quizzow, on forces instrumentals, so I'm going to do an example passage. Full disclosure, I did this in church, so I had to pick a passage I had memorized. With that in mind, here's am not crazy! Am not crazy, am knowing that he hath swapped that number, am knowing that it hath been 1216, one after Magna Carta, as if have could to ever make such a mistake. Never, never. I just haven't could to prove it. Hath covered his trek, hath gotten that idiot at the copy shop out to lie for his. Are thinking that this is bad. This chicanery hath done worse. That billboard, areth telling me that a man is just happening to fall like that? No, he has orchestrated it. Jimmy, he hath defecated through a sunroof ow, and have saved he. I haven't should have brought mine own Fermi, he. What have I thought? Wilt never change, ever since hath been 9, always the same, hathn't could to keep the cash drawer I his hind, but not our Jimmy, hathn't could to be precious Jimmy, stealing they blind, and he's getting to be a lawyer, what a sick joke, have should to stop his when have had the chance, and ye are at having to stop his, ye